Welcome back to another chess game analysis video. Since you guys normally like when I analyze my own games for the channel, I decided to show this game that I played last week in a club tournament. It features quite a nice opening variation of the Caro-Kann defense, which we covered extensively on the channel already, and a couple of nice instructive endgame techniques as well. So let's get into it. I'm playing with the black pieces here. My opponent opens with e4. C6. I studied the Caro-Kann extensively, so that's why I normally play it at the moment in the classical time format. Knight f3, not the main line, but going into this d5 and two knights variation of the Caro-Kann defense. Knight f6 trying to trade off one of the knights early on. Queen e2 set up a very nice trap, which I covered already in one of my trap videos. If you just play knight b7 development, trying to recapture the knight with the other knight, knight d6 is model mate. So be careful not to lose in 6 moves, but instead you need to trade off one of the knights. And after the queen recaptures, now you've got time to develop the other knight, knight d7. Bishop c4, normal development, knight f6 attacks the queen. The queen now doesn't need to move immediately because you have this very nice knight e5 idea. If you take the queen now, this loses to bishop f7 checkmate, which is a known theoretical, I don't want to call it trap, it's just a very nice development move so that the queen doesn't need to retreat immediately. But I know this variation, so I know e6 is theory, this needs to be played in order to prevent checkmate. So now the queen has to move, and my opponent chose f3 as square, which isn't that great normally. Queen e2 is actually better, and this is still known. It's an equal position, and black managed to equalize very early on in the variation, so probably white doesn't have enough to play for a win here, which is okay if you want to play with the black pieces, and if you want to draw early on, this is definitely suitable. So my opponent played queen f3 here, which is a little bit worse because after queen d4 attacking both pieces, the queen needs to move again to e3, which it could have moved there or one move earlier, but my opponent now realized that he has to play queen e3 in order to prevent a loss of one of the pieces. Afterwards, I analyzed that in this position, very interestingly enough, you don't even need to play this queen d4 idea, but you can also play bishop d6, kicking the knight, and for instance d4 defending the knight, you now move the bishop again, bishop b4 check, c3 queen takes d4, now the queen can't be captured because the bishop pin, and now we have development, bishop a5 retreating, rook d1, queen takes, queen e4 check, queen takes e4, knight takes e4, and black is up a pawn, and it's very questionable whether or not white actually has compensation. The engine says minus 0.5, so black is better in this position. White doesn't have full compensation for the pawn, which I think is interesting. So if you reach this position, you can also develop the bishop instead of this queen maneuver that I did. I saw that in the game, but I didn't calculate with moving the bishop twice. Like you move it once and then you move it again to give a check, which is a little bit unnatural for a human to play this move order. But if you study this intensively, I think the bishop development move is quite natural. Also with the queen coming here, you can align against the knight. There are some ideas, I think. But I played it differently. I played queen d4, immediately going for this very forced queen trade, which I like because queens are off the board. And after d takes e3, bishop d6 now, development kicking the knight. Now the knight needs to move to f3. So I was happy with this position, definitely. Middle game equalized early on with black, and the engine favors black slightly after e5, which is a very strong move here and enables the bishop to go to g4, where it would be very active. So e5 early on would be kind of a good move here in this position, but I decided to go for bishop development first and bishop d3, now e5, and he has e4, and you see once he develops his bishop, it's a very equal position. I'm up a tempo here in this position. You realize that the pawn structure is basically the same, but I've got a bishop developed that he has not developed yet. So the engine says it's equal, but for a black black's point of view, this is perfectly playable. So h6. Now I was a little bit afraid. I wanted to develop the bishop here, but I was afraid of some knight jumps trading off the bishop. So I decided h6, not allowing bishop or knight to come to g5. Prophylactic move, and after he plays h3, now bishop e6. A very nice setup with the minor pieces here. This is definitely a little bit of a more strategic game and not a tactical sequence, but we're gonna see a very tactical sequence in a couple of moves. Here he develops the bishop first, and we have c5. He gives a check with the bishop, king e7, knight d2. Now the pawn was attacked, so you need to defend it. a6, kicking the bishop, gaining some space after bishop e2. Rook HDA, now bring the rooks onto the only open file on the board, which is very logical. He castles kingside. I think with one knight pair already traded and the queens off the board, there is not much checkmating potential at the moment. So I decided my king for the endgame on e7 is very well placed, and I don't think you necessarily needed to castle because the king is kind of on the edge of the board, which I'm not so sure about this, but the engine still says it's equal. b5, expanding and gaining some space on the queen side. So we have c4. This is a very interesting way to play this position because it sacrifices a pawn. You see, I can just capture, and the knight is overworked if you capture and the knight needs to capture. Then this pawn is hanging, so it's a little bit strange, but it works tactically if you play this correctly. And I was a little bit surprised that my opponent calculated this, but I think he made a slight miscalculation in one of the lines because I take and he takes with bishop, which is okay. You can also take with the knight, and after knight takes, you reach a position where your dark square bishop gets traded here on d6, and after king takes, we have rook fd8, rook fd1 check, king c6, rook dc1, and this is an equal position. Black is up a pawn, but as you see, there's no way to defend this pawn properly, and white is gonna win back the pawn, and it's an equal endgame. So knight takes was possible, bishop takes is also possible, but then you need to play precisely after knight takes. Now you see the knight here is a little bit overworked. It has to defend the bishop, which is attacked, but it also wants to recapture here. So this is a tough decision, I think, and it needs quite a lot of calculation. And it turns out knight takes is the better option. You give away the bishop, but after the rook comes into the attack on the bishop, bishop retreats, knight takes this very strong dark square bishop, which holds together all your pawns. King takes d6, rook takes c5, and the position is equal. Opposite color bishop endgame with two rooks on the board. This should end in a draw very soon. I would have definitely gone into this. If he captured with the knight, I would have taken the draw with this variation, but he decided to take with the bishop. He decides to take my bishop, which is a mistake actually. And it turns out that I'm going to win a pawn in this variation because I don't recapture the bishop. If you recapture the bishop, the knight recaptures here, and white is actually better. So instead of taking, you first trade off this knight, gaining an attack on the rook, and now you basically force your opponent to take with the bishop, and then you take with the king. And you see after the dust has settled, you're up a pawn. Whether or not this endgame is actually won, it's a little bit questionable. The engine says minus 1.3. I think with best defense, this is still a draw, but with white, you need to be very careful here. So, rook f e1, logical move. Bringing the rooks into the center, f5, expanding with the pawns. Now I need to push my past pawns because now I've got a pawn advantage. So every trade is actually in my favor now from this point of view, from this point in the game, because I'm up a pawn. If everything gets traded, I'm left with a pawn, and this is winning. So he activates his bishop, bishop c3, g6, and now a temporary bishop sacrifice, which I think is very interesting. You can also play this position differently, like trying to double up the rooks and play against my e-pawn. But my opponent chose here to force the matter, which is not that bad actually. I like the idea because Here I'm basically forced to recapture. Now he has f4. Bishop is pinned, so now you are attacking it twice. Only move to defend the pawn. The bishop is rook d5. Now he plays rook a c1, rook c8 defending the pawn, rook c2, trying to double up now. You see, I'm basically up a bishop, but the bishop can always be captured. So as long as the king is here, if I ever move the king, he's just gonna take here. So, but now he doesn't have to, and yeah, I think my opponent played this rather well. Not immediately forcing the matter with the bishop because he can't move anyway. So he waits until I move the king and I lose a tempo, and then he takes here with check. So if I move here, he takes with check. I think a very nice maneuver. Here in this position I'm still better, but I had to find the move g5, destabilizing the whole structure, and now forces him to take the bishop. And rook takes, and this is a one endgame probably. Maybe there are some drawing chances if you play perfectly with white, but I chose to play rook c6. I didn't see this g5 idea undermining the pawn chain. You maybe have ideas like trying to hold on to the pawn chain, but this is still the best approach here. If you want to hold on to your pawn, you need to play g5 here. I just thought I had time, rook c6, but now of course he doubles on the e-file. I played c4. I don't really have any moves. I'm gonna lose the bishop here anyway, and with the whole trade, I'm not up a pawn anymore. He won back the pawn. King d6. Now he chose king f1 to bring his rook closer, his king closer. Rook c5 now offering a rook trade, and this with rook e3 you don't trade the rooks, and the engine says this endgame is very much equal because rook controls the e-file and the third rank, so you can't make progress with black. Even though black is more active with the king, the rook is a little bit better here. He can come into the game, but you can definitely hold this with white. The activity is not enough here. You need to defend it like that. Rook e3 is definitely the way to defend this, and hold the rooks on the board so that you can always defend everything. My opponent here in this position, I think, miscalculated the endgame that arises here, and he chose to trade off the rooks. But this is a huge mistake because now my king comes in there. And now you see my king is way more active than white's king, and even though the material is completely equal, this is winning for black. And here I already calculated the endgame, because the endgame now is pretty much forced. I think you now waste a couple of tempi, h4, a5. The white king always needs to be here, and you always need to try to defend this pawn because it's quite weak. And if the king ever goes to the king side, then you just break through here, win the pawn, and the other pawn pushes through. So very, very difficult. As an example, if you move the king here, then this would be winning. You can't do much. So you're gonna win this pawn, and the a pawn is just gonna queen, and you're gonna win the game easily. So my opponent chose to leave his king on e2, which is the correct way to play this position, but it doesn't really help because a5, a3, a4, king d2. Now he has to move something, and now king e4, attacking this pawn. And I think this endgame, you can't really do much with white. Now you're gonna lose this pawn. He tried to create counterplay on the other side of the board and also create a pass pawn, which works, but it's not enough. In this position he played b4, which I think is a very interesting way to play and probably the best, but it's not enough. If you just try to attack the a pawn, you're just not fast enough. You see, black queens early, and this is just lost. Yeah, you don't need to calculate that much further. So king b4 was too slow, so he tried b4, which forces me to take on passant, and after king takes, now we have a race of these two pawns. This pawn marches forward, this one as well. I need to capture the g pawn first, and you can try to calculate this position. Here in this position, I was quite confident that I'm gonna win this game. Because the variation is very forced. You need a couple minutes maybe to calculate this through, but in a classical game this shouldn't be a problem. And you don't have any other plans anyway. I mean, if you walk back, this is just too slow. So I take king takes g2, and now the pawns. We have a pawn race. a4, f4, we have a5, f3, h6, a6, f2, a7, f1 queen. I queen first, but now he has this very nice a8 queen check, and it was here in this position he was hoping for a perpetual check so that he can always check my king with his queen and it's gonna be a draw. But we have this very nice queen f3, I think a brilliant move. You block the check with your queen and you check the white king on the same time, which forces, in this position my opponent resigned the game because he saw that he has to trade queens and I'm just gonna win the h-pawn and the two passed pawns are gonna win the game. I think very nice pawn race. The endgame was very instructive for me. These pawn endgames are very tricky and you need to calculate very precisely on the tempo that or the tempi that something needs, because in this position it was exactly one tempo that saved me from a perpetual check. It was this queen f3 that was possible and that saved the game. I think a very instructive endgame because let's go back to this position. Here white still had an equal position. After the rook trade it was completely lost. So instructional endgame, I think. Reminder, hold the rooks on the board if you are defending and if you try to hold the draw. Don't trade off too much material and allow king activity because this pawn endgame was clearly lost and hard to defend. I think it was not possible to defend after the rook trade. This is just completely winning. So I hope this was instructional as well for you, and I hope you learned something in the endgame or the opening variation in the Caro-Kann defense. If you want to see live chess gameplay, check out my Twitch. Check out my other Caro-Kann videos if you're interested in that. You can check out my playlist. I also created a lead chess community study where you can analyze all these variations for yourself. If you want to annotate them with your own notes, you can also make more moves if you want to study one variation more deeply. I hope you learned something and I'm gonna see you back in another video. Bye.